So hopefully you can tell by the title, instead of finding a side length like we were doing yesterday, we're going to be finding a missing angle using side lengths. But I just want to remind you that if we have, or if we're trying to finding a side, if we're trying to find a side, what we would normally do is plug in a number there, and maybe we'd have like x over some number. Or we would maybe have cosine of something. Again, we're plugging in an angle there, and maybe we have some number over x. Or tangent, we could use tangent as well. But this is for finding a side. So for these, we plug in an angle and set up a ratio. So we plug in an angle to there, and the ratio that we set up is that and that, and then we solve. That's what we were doing yesterday when we were finding a side length. Today, we are going to be looking at, maybe I'll put this in a box. So finding a side. Today we're going to look at how to find an angle. So we're going to be using different things. And then we're going to have to find, I'm going to sneeze, maybe. Nope, never mind. To find an angle, we use the inverse trig functions. And I will show you what they are, and I'll show you what they look like on the calculator too. So to find an angle, like a missing angle, we use the inverse trig functions, which look like this. Or maybe arc sine. These are exactly the same thing. They mean exactly the same thing. Sine inverse or arc sine. You could call this arc sine. You could call this sine inverse. They're both the same thing, but that's how you would say it. Sine inverse, cosine inverse, or arc cosine. On some calculators, it'll show arc cosine. On some calculators, you'll see the cosine with the -1. And then tangent, tangent inverse, that'd be arc tangent. This is not the same thing as 1 over sine, just by the way. I don't know if you remember that notation, but it's not the same thing. So those are the inverse trig functions. These mean the same thing. So for these, we're not plugging in angles to these. So I'll say for these, we plug in side ratios. For these, we plug in side ratios. And we get out angles. So on this side, we would plug in an angle, we would set up a ratio, and we would use it to solve for x. On this, we're really just plugging in side ratios into the parentheses. And then we'll just type that in our calculator, and this will spit out the angles that we want, as long as we set them up properly. So for these, we plug in side ratios, and we get out angles. So angles will come out of these. So on your calculator, if you have an iOS calculator, this is what it looks like. To access these buttons, you would hit this second key over here. So if you hit second, then you can see sine inverse, cosine inverse, tangent inverse. If you don't know how to do it on your calculator, let me know. But usually it's the second key, and then it switches from regular trig to inverse trig stuff. So if you don't know how to access that, let me know. And I'll show you how to plug it in when we do the first example.